Instrumental repairs, question 1. Which choice most effectively sets up the sentence that follows in the paragraph? So assuming you've read the first sentence, let's focus on the sentence that follows. It says, guitars need new frets, clarinets need rusty keys cleaned or replaced, and pianos need to be tuned. So the main idea here is that these instruments need upkeep or maintenance. So let's read what the original says. Millions of musicians from around the world, from school groups to rock bands to professional symphony orchestras, practice, perform, and travel regularly, meaning they must make arrangements for their instruments to travel with them. Now that might be true, but making arrangements for their instruments to travel with them doesn't have to do with upkeep or maintenance or cleaning, so A is not likely going to be the answer. Looking at choice B, it says, meaning their instruments undergo considerable wear and tear. So wear and tear does have to do with upkeep and maintenance, so B is going to be the answer. Choice C, introducing audiences worldwide to a range of musical instruments. Again, nothing to do with upkeep. Choice D, helping keep those who make musical instruments very busy. So also maybe true, but nothing to do with the upkeep of the instruments. So B is the best choice. Question 2. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. So assuming that you read through the first paragraph, again, we were talking about maintenance, and then just quickly glance at the sentence following. It says, for comprehensive maintenance and repairs, musicians need musical instrument technicians. So here we introduce the idea of the people who actually do the repairs. Now let's read the sentence. It says, piano tuning became a profession at the start of the 19th century when the harpsichord was superseded by the modern piano. So automatically I know that this sentence really has nothing to do with the topic of the paragraph, which is instrument maintenance and instrument technicians. So I'm going to cross off choices A and B without even reading them. Choice C, no, because it fails to address the development of the modern guitar and modern clarinet. Again, not something that we are talking about at all in the first paragraph. We don't really need to hear about the guitar or the clarinet, so C is out. Choice D, no, because it offers tangential information about piano tuning that interrupts the paragraph's progression of ideas. Yes, tangential information is information that's not related, and it definitely interrupts the progression of ideas, talking about maintenance and instrument technicians. So D is going to be our best choice. Question 3, let's read the sentence. It says, for comprehensive maintenance and potent repairs, musicians need musical instrument technicians, trained professionals, I think that should say trained professionals, with an expert knowledge of both mechanics and music. So obviously this is a diction question. Diction means word choice. So in choice A, is potent a good word to describe repairs? Probably not, because potent can mean something like powerful or effective. So you'd say something like a potent drink or a potent vaccine. Generally not something that we would use to describe the type of repair. So A is going to be out. Choice B, definite. If you were to say definite repairs, the only way that I can conceive of that making sense would be if you meant definite as in there were limits imposed. So if you said something like definite standards, that could possibly make some sense, but either way, not a great choice here. Choice C, conclusive. Now the word conclusive means that you're putting an end to any controversy or debate. So you would say something like conclusive results. In other words, results that settle the question. Conclusive repairs, kind of awkward because it's not like the repairs was bringing about any type of question. So C is going to be out. And choice D, significant repairs. Yeah, significant in this case probably means very important, or it probably implies something about degree. So a significant repair would mean that there's probably a lot of damage, sort of like when you say significant profits. So choice D is the best answer. Question 4, which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? So keep in mind, we're looking to combine two sentences. Let's read it. Becoming a musical instrument technician requires dedication. It requires dedication to learning the intricacies of instruments. So two ideas. It requires dedication, and what type of dedication is it? Learning the intricacies of instruments. Obviously, one thing that makes this awkward is we're repeating the word dedication, never a good stylistic choice. Let's go through the answers. Choice A, it requires one particular form of dedication, that is dedication to learning the intricacies of instruments. So again, kind of wordy. We're also repeating the word dedication, so not likely going to be the answer. Choice B, it requires dedication to learning the intricacies of instruments. So B sounds good. It's very straightforward, very concise. It basically just says what type of dedication is required, the type of dedication to learning intricacies of instruments. B seems like it'll work. Choice C, it requires dedication to instruments intricacies that can only be learned. So a couple things to say about this. The most obvious is the SAT generally doesn't like the passive voice, so that should raise a red flag there. And also we're kind of changing the sense of, or we're changing the meaning. In other words, the original said it requires dedication to learning something. Here it's dedication to the intricacies. So a little bit of change in meaning, also a passive voice, definitely not better than choice B. Choice D, it requires that instruments intricacies be learned, passive again, by individuals who have dedicated themselves to that purpose. Passive and also wordy, so B is clearly the best choice. Question 5, let's read the sentence starting here. Many technicians are a musician themselves, and some also have professional backgrounds in business, marketing, or engineering. I'm going to stop there because that's a complete sentence. So automatically what I notice is that it says many technicians, which is plural, are a musician. So you want plural with plural, singular with singular. This is agreement. So A is going to be out based on agreement. Choice B, same problem, a musician. So for the same reason. Choice C, many technicians are musicians themselves. So clearly we've fixed the singular plural disagreement, and C is likely going to be the answer. Choice D, many technicians are musicians, him or herself. So again, this part doesn't agree internally with itself because musicians is plural and him or herself is singular. And if you're curious what the function of putting themselves after musician is, it's probably just for emphasis. Like if you were to emphasize something that you did, you would say, I myself wrote that, or I myself did that, as opposed to me plus anybody else. Question 6, let's start reading right over here. If an instrument is not performing to musician standards, a technician needs to be able to diagnose the problem and then advise the client and perform repairs. And we'll stop here. All right, so automatically we see one big problem. It's a technician needs to be able to diagnose the problem, and then we need THEN because these are two actions that happen in sequence. Then means time, then with an A is for comparison. For the most part, depending on where you live in the US, they're pronounced the same way. So let's cross out any choices with THAN. That would be choice A and choice B. And then the next problem we see is that notice the technician is doing a few things. The technician needs to be able to, 1, diagnose the problem, and then 2, advise the client and perform repairs. So we need a verb. Advice with a C is a noun. It means guidance, but advise with an S means to give advice or to give guidance. So D is going to be out because advice is wrong. It's a noun, not a verb, and C is the answer. So this is another diction problem on the SAT. The reason that they ask those is because a lot of times people confuse words that look similar but are actually different, such as in this case, advise versus advice. And so they're trying to catch you on that. Question 7 is asking about this transition word. So let's read the sentence. It says, likewise, a trumpet might not be functioning properly because the valves have become sticky, the joints have developed air leaks, or the metal parts have been dented. So basically these are types of damage that can happen. So to answer this question, you have to keep in mind what the previous sentence says, which we just read. It says, if an instrument is not performing to musician standards, the technician needs to be able to diagnose the problem, advise the client, and perform repairs. So how is that idea of the technician being able to figure out what the problem is and do the repairs related to these types of repairs that are listed? They're obviously examples. So the best choice just from glancing at it is going to be B, because for instance signals that you're going to introduce examples. If you say likewise, likewise means something like in addition to or similarly. It would work if you're going to say a similar idea. So for example, if you said likewise, the musician also has to be aware of what the problem is, because then it's pointing at a similarity between the technician and the musician. That could work, but not here. Choice C, in the first place. So in the first place can have a couple different meanings. On the one hand, it means something like what should have been done originally. So if you say we should not have been here in the first place. Another use of in the first place would be when you're listing a reason or an idea that's more important. So if you said something like, I'm not going to tell you because in the first place, I don't know you. And in the second place, it's like not my place to tell you. That would be proper usage. So it's an idiomatic expression. In this case, it would only make sense if you're giving reasons or an expansion in the previous sentence. So if, the previous sentence is saying that the technicians have to diagnose the problem. Then if you said, in the first place, this can take a long time, and in the second place, this might take a lot of money. That could be building on that idea, but that's clearly not what's going on here. And choice C, furthermore, would just be adding on to what you said before. For question 8, we have to start reading right over here. It says, likewise, a trumpet might not be functioning properly because the valves have become sticky, the joints have developed air leaks, or the metal parts have been dented. So all in all, this looks okay. What's going on is we're listing 3 things, A, comma, B, comma, or C, and that's really the proper way to do it. So A seems like it's going to work. Notice B, C, and D all add extra punctuation. So for choice B, it would be inappropriate to place a semicolon right after the second item and then a comma after or, so that's going to be out. Choice C, it's not necessary to set off the word or with another comma after it, so that's also wrong. Choice D, in a list that's set off by commas, you just want to be consistent. A, comma, B, comma, or C. There's no reason to put a dash there, so D is going to be out also. Question 9, let's start reading here. It says, large instrument manufacturers such as Steinway, for example, hires instrument technicians to work at their factories and retail stores. So the first thing I'm going to notice is, what is the subject of this verb hires? Because all the answer choices have to do with either subject-verb agreement, singular plural, or tense. So I'm going to cross off such as Steinway, for example, and the subject is actually the manufacturers, which is third person plural. So if the manufacturers, third person plural, hire also has to be third person plural, and so that means choice D is likely going to be the answer. So we'll cross off choice A. Let's look at the rest of them. Choice B, has hired. So number 1, this is wrong because of agreement. It should say have hired. And then the question is present tense better than present perfect, which is what choice B is? So if you're going to say the manufacturers have hired someone, that probably means that it started in the past and it implies that this person is still working for them, because present perfect means that something started in the past and it has continuing effects. Present perfect can also be used to denote like experience, like I have gone there. In this case, present tense is more appropriate than present perfect because we're just talking about a general trend. These manufacturers generally hire instrument technicians to work at their stores, and this is something that's ongoing. So B is going to be out for both agreement and wrong tense. Choice C, same thing. Notice third person plural, it should say manufacturers are hiring, and then it changes present tense to present progressive. And present progressive tense is generally used for something that is an ongoing action that you're in the middle of right now. So you would say, I am eating, or I am talking. In other words, it's an action that has a definite beginning and an end point. In this case, present tense is still more appropriate, so C is going to be out, and D is the best answer. Question 10, it says, the writer wants to add the following sentence to the paragraph. Other technicians open their shops to serve their communities. And then it says, to make the paragraph most logical, the sentence should be placed where. So the key thing here is other technicians. And what you'll notice is if you've read the paragraph, we're actually talking about 2 technicians, Tom Weber in sentence 4 and 5, and then Michelle Lamb in sentences 6 and 7. So the most logical place for this would be right between sentences 5 and 6. And also, for further evidence, the sentence is saying the other technicians open their own shops to serve their communities. That's what Michelle Lamb is doing versus Tom Weber, who is basically just traveling with bands. But the 2 words, other technicians itself, should lead you to see exactly where it needs to be placed, and C is the answer. Question 11, let's start reading right over here. It says, live performances, studio sessions, and the careers of individual musicians all rely on instrument technicians to keep equipment in top shape and the music playing on. So that sentence sounds okay. A is likely going to be the answer. Let's see how they try to fix it. Choice B, notice what they do. They put a sentence right after musicians, so it would read as live performances, studio sessions, and the careers of individual musicians, period. And what happens is this becomes a fragment because there's no verb to go with these three subjects. So B is going to be out. Choice C does the same thing because by using a semicolon, you still have the problem of not having a complete sentence here as well as not having a complete sentence here. So with a semicolon, you need an independent clause on both sides. So C is going to be out. Choice D, it's kind of interesting. Let's read it through. Live performances, studio sessions, and the careers of individual musicians, all of which rely on instrument technicians to keep equipment in top shape and the music playing on. And as you're reading it, you should feel like, hey, I need something else here, because what's going on is by putting a comma here, you turn this whole piece into sort of like a modifying phrase, which is describing your three subjects, and then you need a verb. So one way to fix this would be live performances, sessions, and career, all of which rely on these people, will likely continue in the future. So not a great sentence, but you see what I'm trying to get at. You need a main verb to complete this idea. And so that's why choice D is not going to work and A is the answer. Next passage, remix, reuse, repurpose. That's sort of like reduce, reuse, and recycle. Maybe that's why they wrote it that way. Question 12, which choice best introduces the topic of the passage? So for questions like these, what I'll do is I'll read through the paragraph very quickly, like almost skimming it. And I won't really pay attention to what's underlined because if the answer is wrong, then it's probably just going to be a distractor. So obviously the topic sentence is talking about digital technology, creating more opportunities for creativity. And then they talk about remixes and, things that they're doing in terms of music. So that automatically tells me choice D is going to be the answer because the whole paragraph and then the passage, if you read it, talks about specifically music. So if you go with choice A, it says, digital technology has expanded opportunities for expression no matter the art form. A would work if the whole passage were talking about other forms of art, music, visual art, performing art, that type of thing, but they really don't, so it's not necessary. In other words, it doesn't introduce the topic of the passage very well. So you want to stay very closely to what they're asking for. Choice B, enriching artists worldwide. Again, a little bit too vague. That might be true based on what the passage is going to say, but it doesn't really introduce the topic of, using music and remixing it very well. Choice C, even among software developers. So nothing in the passage talks about software developers, and that's why C is going to be out. And so D is the best answer. Question 13, we can actually start reading right after the colon because this is a complete sentence. The spread of software that can be used to cut parts from different songs and paste them together have spurred the creation of a music genre known as remix or mashup. So you'll notice that like the previous question, or like a question in the previous passage, this has to do with both tense and subject-verb agreement. So let's figure out what the subject is. What has spurred the creation of a musical genre? If you read back, it's actually the spread, which is the subject of the sentence. It's not software because software is inside this preposition phrase, and it's nothing actually in here because this whole clause, it's a relative clause acting as an adjective, which is describing software. And you know that because you can read the sentence smoothly by saying the spread of blah, blah, blah has spurred the creation. Because spread is third person singular, we need to say has. So B is likely going to be the answer. A is definitely out because have is third person plural, or could be also second person singular. Choice C, the spread are spurring. Again, spread is singular, so you'd have to say is spurring. Choice D, same problem. Spread is third person singular, so it should say the spread was spurring if you're going to use past progressive. But both C and D, as far as the tense goes, it makes it inconsistent with the beginning of the sentence because the beginning of the sentence says digital technology has expanded. So that's present perfect. So that's why generally you want to keep it consistent. So B is better than C and D in terms of tense, and C and D are also wrong in terms of agreement. Question 14, let's start reading right up here. It says, opponents of this art form maintain that remix artists violate copyright law because they borrow material from protected works to the financial detriment of the original artist. So this one sounds okay. Financial detriment means financial damage or financial injury, like something can be a detriment to your health. So and that's exactly what the point is. Let's look at the other choices, and we'll notice that this is a diction question. So it's really the question is, what kind of word goes well with financial sort of damage or financial injury? Choice B, financial deterioration. So deterioration implies something more like a decrease in quality. So you'd say like a deterioration in standards or deterioration in the quality of something. I mean, overall, you could say that there's financial deterioration in terms of how a company is run or managed. But in this case, we're talking about more specific damage that would result from, what these remix artists are doing. So B is not better than detriment. Choice C, financial wounding. So wounding is a little more closely tied to the literal definition. If someone got physically wounded or even emotionally wounded, you could say your ego is wounded. Financial wounding is not really a phrase that's used. You wouldn't normally use wounding in terms of finances. So C is going to be out. Choice D, financial limitations. So D is actually changing the idea here. They're actually saying that remix artists are causing financial damage to the original artist, not so much a financial limitation or restriction. So D is definitely out, and A is going to be the best answer. Question 15, start reading right over here. Using only a laptop, Gillis collects samples from songs ranging from rock ballads to hip hop, cuts them to different lengths, some as short as a single drum beat, and arranging them into a different form. So notice what's going on here. We're actually getting a list of 3 things that he's doing. Gillis, number 1, collects, he cuts, and he arranges. That's the word that we're looking for. In other words, all these verbs are third person singular: collects, cuts, and arranges. So the only one that's going to make sense in terms of consistency as well as subject-verb agreement is choice B. Question 16, let's start reading right over here. Although his critically acclaimed 2006 album Night Ripper consists of hundreds of samples from different artists, Gillis believes his songs are original because they recontextualize the source material into a new whole. So the SAT typically doesn't ask about quotation marks or punctuation around quotation marks. So one way to approach this would be to simply ignore the fact that there are quotation marks and just realize that in this sentence, they recontextualize. This is the subject and this is the verb, recontextualize. There's really no reason to put a comma in between your subject and a verb ever. So that leads us to answer C, which basically just removes it. And for that same reason, B and D are also going to be wrong. For semicolon, we've already said before and after the semicolon, you want a complete sentence. With a colon, it generally follows the same form. Before the colon, you generally have a complete sentence. Colons are basically used to introduce things like lists or explanations. So if you said something like, Shakespeare said it best, colon, to thine own self be true, that would make sense. But notice that if you're saying Shakespeare said it best, that's a complete sentence. Or if you're using it to introduce a list, you can say, we covered the basics in the course, colon, nouns, verbs, verbals, blah, blah, blah. So you're using the colon to introduce a list, but before the colon, you generally have a complete sentence. Now, the other thing to mention is whether or not the SAT is going to ask future questions about quotations and punctuation. The thing that I would remember in case they do is generally if you're going to introduce a quote with some type of speech word like said, so for example, if we say Gillis said, then you would use a comma, quote, my songs are great. In this case, we're using a comma before we introduce a quotation because we're using a word before it like said or remarked or reflected. On the other hand, if you say something like Gillis said that his songs were, and then you want to quote him from this point, great and original. In this particular case, you don't need to introduce the quotation with a comma because what's in the quotation fits grammatically into the sentence itself. So likewise, that's what's going on in the original sentence. Gillis believes his songs are original because they recontextualize. And as I said, they is the subject, recontextualize is the verb. It follows smoothly if you were to read it even without the quotation marks. So comma, not necessary in this situation, but it is necessary in this situation. And both of these are correct sentences. Question 17, the sentence starts on the previous page, but we can actually start reading from here. So he believes his sampling qualifies as fair use, a legally permissible borrowing of copyrighted material for a transformative purpose. So if you glance at the answers, they're all kind of really saying the same thing. This question is asking mostly about what is the most effective way to get an idea across, and usually there's a bit of redundancy in the wrong answers. So for now, this sounds okay. It's a legally permissible borrowing. In other words, borrowing is the gerund, it's sort of a noun, permissible is the adjective. Legally is the adverb describing the adjective permissible. Let's look at the other choices. Fair use, a legal and lawful use of copyrighted material. So what you'll notice is legal and lawful basically mean the same thing, so it is redundant, something the SAT doesn't like. Choice C, his sampling qualifies as fair use, a legal acquisition through borrowing. So this is kind of changing the meaning. They're not trying to say that he's legally acquiring the music or the samples by what he's doing. So legal acquisition through borrowing is probably just not the right idea. Choice D, fair use, a valid means or acceptable method, in other words, to borrow. So obviously this should just sound wordy to you. Saying valid means and then acceptable method is also saying the same thing twice, so it's also redundant. So we'll get rid of it, and that means the best choice is A. Question 18, to improve the cohesion and flow of this paragraph, the writer wants to add the following sentence. His songs are composed entirely of samples, excerpts taken from one song for use in another. So this is sort of an explanation of what that guy Gillis is doing. We have to look back at the beginning of the paragraph. So notice what's going on in the paragraph. In the first sentence, they introduce who this guy is, Grad Gillis. The second paragraph, they talk specifically about what he does. He uses a laptop, he collects samples, and they say what kind it is. So as you're reading this, you should realize that the sentence that they give should go somewhere around sentence 2. To me, in my opinion, sentence 2 and the new sentence are kind of saying the same thing, so I say you don't really need it. But given that the new sentence, his songs are composed entirely of samples, excerpts taken from one song for use in another, that's a more general sentence than is sentence 2. So, when you write, you want to start with general and then you get into more detail. So the best place to put this would be between sentence 1 and sentence 2. So for question 18, we're going to go with A after sentence 1. You really should have been debating between A and B, if anything. Question 19, it says, which aspect of fair use most effectively sets up the next sentence in the paragraph? So again, we have to follow these questions very carefully. Let's start reading in the paragraph. For material to qualify as fair use, however, the borrower must not only transform the meaning of the original, but also, I'm actually not going to read this, and I'm just going to read the next sentence. If using a sample hurts the sale of a copyrighted work, then it does not qualify as fair use. So what's the main idea here? We're talking about hurting the sale of something that was already copyrighted. So let's look at the answers and see which one connects. So the first one, choice A, it says the borrower must not only transform the meaning, but also borrow only a small part of it. Maybe, but not exactly a direct connection to hurting the sale, so we'll cross it off. B, not damage its economic value. That seems to be very much related to hurting the sale, so that's most likely the answer. C, not incorporate its most memorable aspects. Again, memorable aspects doesn't have anything to do with the sale, so we'll cross it off. But also use the work for the purpose of commentary or criticism. Also nothing to do with sale, so D is going to be out, and B is our best choice. Again, in my opinion, it sounds somewhat redundant, but again, these are supposed to be like student-written essays, and sometimes they don't really sound the best, but they're just looking for whatever it is that they're asking. Question 20, let's start reading from the beginning of the paragraph. Although it is important protecting artists by not allowing complete copies of their work to be distributed without permission, Remix art is not a mere verbatim copy, but a repurposing of source materials that makes its audience think about how one piece of art fits into the broader cultural landscape. Really long sentence, but the important thing here is when you were reading it, this should have sounded wrong to you. This is an idiom question. Generally, you don't say it is important protecting with an ing verb. You have to follow important with an infinitive, so you'd say it is important to protect artists. So that's idiom, which basically means how words are used together. In other words, how phrases are put together generally. There's really no logic behind it. You just kind of have to know it. Question 21, we're going to read from the same sentence. Although it is important to protect artists by not doing blah, 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 remix art is not a mere verbatim copy, but a repurposing of source materials that makes its audience think about how one piece of art fits into the broader cultural landscape. So notice what the choices are. We're talking about singular versus plural, and the other question is whether this needs to be possessive. So when you read this sentence, the question is, who does the audience belong to? And it belongs to remix art. Because the sentence is really saying remix art is not a copy, but it's a repurposing that makes its audience, in other words, remix art's audience, think about how one piece blah, blah, blah. So this definitely should be possessive because the audience, in a sense, is belonging to the remix art, in which case it''s is not possessive. It's a contraction for it is, so that's what makes it wrong. So B is going to be the answer. And if you're looking at choices C and D, since we've decided that this needs to be possessive, what it really should be is THEIR. That would be possessive plural. But since remix art is singular, there is not going to work, and these two are wrong anyway, so the answer is going to be B. Question 22, the writer wants the conclusion to restate an important idea in the passage. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? So let's read it right over here. The law should encourage, not inhibit, this creative interaction with culture, especially when the remix is wildly popular. So, I mean, that's okay. Is there a better choice? Let's read through it. Especially when the remix wins critical acclaim. Also, not terrible. When the remix improves on the source material. Okay, I'm not really sure if they said that in the passage. Especially when the remix renews interest in the original. So choice D was definitely said, and specifically that's in the previous paragraph right over here where it says, a girl talk song that features Notorious B.I.G. and Elton John might send listeners running to hear more from the Brooklyn rapper, that's Notorious B.I.G., and the British song Smith, that's Elton John. So D is the only one that was really stated in the whole passage, so that's why it's going to be the answer. Next passage, the motivation of reputation. Question 23. Let's start reading from the beginning. Motivating people to engage in socially beneficial behaviors, such as conserving energy resources, is a challenge. So notice what's going on here. We've got this clause right here, such as conserving energy resources, is a challenge. It's set off on the one hand by a comma and then a dash. That's inconsistent. So you just want to be consistent. So the answer is definitely going to be C. And also notice that you can read the sentence smoothly without it. Motivating people to engage in socially beneficial behaviors is a challenge. So that's another way to indicate that this is a clause that needs to be set off consistently, either two dashes or two commas. This is a relatively common question that I've seen on the SAT. Choice B and D are not consistent. Here, there's no punctuation. Here, they change the comma to a semicolon. Question 24, let's start reading right over here. Harvard economist Erez Yoeli and his colleagues have learned, however, that reputation is a strong incentive for making choices that aid the public good in ways that benefit everyone. So when you're reading this, you should automatically realize that, hey, if we're talking about the public good, obviously because it's the public good, it's going to benefit everyone. So this is an instance of redundancy, and that's something that the SAT likes to ask about. So let's see how they fix it. Aid the public good in society, also kind of redundant because the public good is obviously society. Aid the public good for all, redundant, and the best choice is that it aids the public good, period. No need to explain what the public good is again. Question 25, it says, which choice best introduces the primary focus of the paragraph? So like I said, for these types of questions, I don't actually read what's written. I kind of just skim the paragraph first. So it says, Yoeli's team of researchers did something by comparing different sign-up methods for a voluntary program, blah, blah, blah. And then if you read the rest of the paragraph, what you'll see is that they're actually talking about the experiment that they conducted. So let's go through the answer choices. It says, the team of researchers theorized about the historical importance of reputation, not really what they did, so A is going to be out. Choice B, they tested the effectiveness of reputation incentives. Yes, that's exactly what they did, because the experiment was seeing how well reputation, impacted whether they would follow the policy or not. Choice C, they proposed a new kind of reward system. That one might have thrown you off, but it's really not so much a reward system. It was giving them more two options about whether they would sign up using a code or sign up using their name. So not as good as B. Choice D, they convince people to get involved in their neighborhoods. This is too broad, and it's not really saying what exactly is going on as well as B does. So we'll go with that as the answer. 26, which choice best maintains the style of the passage? So let's read it. It says, for the program, participants okayed the installation of a device in their homes that limited the use of an air conditioning unit when demand for energy was highest. So the idea that you okayed something, that's a very informal way of agreeing to it, or informal way of saying that you agree to something. Generally, the expression that you okayed something is used more so in spoken English as opposed to written English, and especially not in an essay like this, unless you're actually quoting someone. So A is not likely going to be the answer. B, they gave the thumbs up to the installation of the device. Also pretty informal, not really appropriate in this type of essay. Choice C, they permitted the installation. So this one seems okay because it's a straightforward use of the word permitted. In other words, they allowed the installation of the device in their homes. Choice D, they gave the green light to. Again, this is a very colloquial phrase or an idiomatic term, which basically means the same thing as okayed, gave the thumbs up, and permitted. They all pretty much mean the same thing, but A, B, and D are too informal. So C is going to be the answer. Question 27, the sentence starts here. Researchers place a sign-up sheet in a public place in housing developments and apartment buildings. So this is a question that has to do with tense, just by glancing at the answer choices. What you should realize is that every time they describe what the researchers did in this whole paragraph, they're using past tense. It says they theorized. Well, that was the wrong answer. Participants permitted. That was the correct answer in choice C. And then in the last sentence, some residents were asked. And so basically you're looking for past tense, and the only one that works is choice D. Researchers placed a sign-up sheet in a public place. Notice what's interesting about the verb placed. Its form does not change in the past tense no matter what the number or person is. So you say, I placed, you placed, he, she, it placed, we placed, they placed. So number is not really a question here. No, neither is person. It's really just tense. Question 28, the sentence says, the researchers found that the observable sign-up strategy was 3 times more effective than the anonymous one. So looking at the answer choices, this has to do with idiom. So the idiom that you have to know here is A is more, and then whatever adjective, in this case we're going to say effective, than B. And that's the idiom. A is more something than B. So the original is correct. Notice that choices B and D change the idiom. You would be saying A is more effective compared with B, or A is more effective as opposed to B, which is incorrect. C is a little bit interesting because what it's doing is it's changing the comparison. Instead of saying A is more effective than B, the idiom is okay. They're saying A is more effective than that of B. This would be appropriate if you are comparing an aspect of A or an aspect of B. So an example would be, let's say you're comparing two people. You could say Mary's hair is lighter than that of Jane's. You would need to use that of because you're comparing hair to hair. An incorrect comparison would be Mary's hair is lighter than Jane, because then you'd be comparing hair to Jane. So if you can say Mary's hair is lighter than Jane's, or Mary's hair is lighter than that of James, that would work. So choice C, the problem is with comparison. not with the idiom, but there's really nothing else that we're comparing. We're actually just comparing this strategy is more effective than that strategy. So there's no need to put that of. Question 29, let's start reading right over here. It says, even though people who enrolled in the program believed that they would suffer an inconvenience, less control over home temperature at certain times of the day, but the publicity of the choice to sign up was incentive enough for many to accept the inconvenience, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just going to stop here. What you'll notice is that the sentence starts off with even though, which already signals a contrast, and then it uses the word but on top of that. So that's kind of redundant. You don't need to do that. You basically just want to pick one or the other. You could say, people who enrolled in the program believe that they would suffer an inconvenience, but the publicity of the choice, blah, blah, blah. Or you can say, even though people who enrolled believe that they would suffer an inconvenience, the publicity of the choice to sign up was incentive enough. You don't really need to say both. Looking at choice A, it's obviously wrong. B, even though blah, 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 as well as, doesn't make sense. Even though blah, 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 however, same problem as A. Even though blah, 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 and deleting the underlined portion is probably going to be your best solution. So D is going to be the answer. Question 30, which choice provides the best transition from the previous paragraph to the information that follows? So they want something that connects the two paragraphs. You know, just glancing, we're talking about reputation, and they're saying the strength of its influence varies based on the likeliness of one's participation being noticed. This is kind of the main point of this paragraph because they're talking about observability. So let's read through it. Since the reputation sometimes fails to promote good deeds, that doesn't make sense because the previous paragraph never said that reputation fails to promote good deeds. It basically was saying that reputation was a pretty powerful indicator. So A is not likely going to be the answer. B, although reputation can be a powerful motivator, the strength of its influence varies. That makes sense because they're saying, hey, reputation in general helps get people to do, I guess, the right thing, but it varies in terms of strength based on where they are. So B, we're going to keep. Choice C, reputation is the single most important factor in decisions and the strength varies. So number one, they never said that it's the single most important factor. They never even said that it's the most important factor. And these are kind of contrasting ideas. Reputation being an important factor kind of contrasts with the idea that the strength varies based on location. So I wouldn't use the word and, I'd say reputation is an important factor in decisions, but the strength of its influence varies. In other words, you're putting a limiting factor on that strength. So C is going to be out. Choice D, one cannot account for the power. The strength of its influence varies based on the likelihood. So grammatically, what's wrong with D is this is a complete sentence. One cannot account for the power. I'm not really sure if this is more of a comma splice or a fused sentence. You could say the strength of its influence varies as a complete sentence. You could also say one cannot account for the power, comma, the strength of its influence, meaning to say that you were really trying to say one cannot account for the power or the strength of its influence. Regardless, it doesn't really make sense. So D is going to be out, and the answer is B. Question 31, which choice is best supported by information in the graph? So we'll have to look at that. Let's read it first. It says, in residences where sign-up sheets were posted in high-activity public spaces, like a shared mall area, anonymous enrollment was 4.8% and observable enrollment was 11.4%, a difference of, it's going to say 6.6% on the next page. So really what we want to focus on is in the high-activity places, anonymous was 4.8 and observable was 11.4. Let's look at the graph. So we are comparing anonymous and observable. Anonymous is white, observable is gray. On the vertical axis, this is the enrollment, and then they're comparing observable and anonymous in two areas, low activity and high activity. So we care about the high activity. We read 4.8 and 11.4, so that seems to be correct. Let's go back to it. All right, so what do they want us to fix? Where the sign-up sheets were posted. So that seems okay because it says in residences where the sign-up sheets were posted, then we get our numbers. So A we'll keep for now. Choice B, in residences where a sign-up sheet was posted. This is weird. It makes me wonder whether this was actually printed or recreated correctly because we're basically repeating the verb. In residences where sign-up sheets was posted, and then you're going to say were posted. So, in a general sense, you probably could say in residences where a sign-up sheet was posted, that would make sense. Or where sign-up sheets, plural, were posted, that would also make sense. I don't think it's a big deal here. But it's not really clear whether this was written correctly. Regardless, the way it's written now, it's repeating the verb was posted and then were posted. Choice C and D actually have the same thing going on. So let's look back at the sentence and see what's going on. It says, in residences where sign-up sheets were posted in high activity spaces. All this is sort of like a giant preposition phrase that begins the sentence, because the subject of the sentence is anonymous enrollment. So you're saying in residences where blah, 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 anonymous enrollment was 4.8%. Notice what happens when we correct it with these choices. You're saying in residences with the most people living in them, then you're saying were posted in high activity public spaces. Because there's no noun here that takes on this verb were, when you read it, your mind is thinking like residences should be the subject of were, but because it's in this preposition phrase, it doesn't make sense. So how would I fix choice C? You could say something like, in residences with the most people living in them, comma, cross off all of this, and then just go straight to the subject. Anonymous enrollment was 4.8%. Same thing for choice D. In residences where the fewest people enrolled in the program, you need to follow with the subject of the sentence. In this case, it's going to be anonymous enrollment. So C and D are both out for that reason, and A is going to be the best answer. Question 32. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. So keep in mind, the sentence that we just read was focusing on the percentages in this high activity public space. Now let's see what they want to add. But in those with less active public spaces, anonymous enrollment was 2.4% and observable enrollment was 3.8%, a difference of only 1.4 percentage points. So low activity here, 2.4, 3.8 with a difference of 1.4. So to me, that seems like relevant information, because on the one hand, even though there is a difference between anonymous and observable in both settings, what they're emphasizing is that number one, the number of observable enrollment was that much higher in the high activity space, and the difference between the two was that much greater. So I'm going to say yes. I'll cross off C and D. Now let's read the reasons why. Yes, because it uses information from the graph to acknowledge an opposing point of view regarding the issue. So it's definitely not an opposing point of view. This actually backs up the main idea of the passage. Choice B, yes, because it provides accurate evidence from the graph to support the paragraph's argument. So yes, B is going to be the answer. And the idea is that the more observable it is, the more likely they are to participate. Question 33, we're going to start reading all the way up here. The more observable the community-minded action, the more likely those are to benefit the individual's reputation. So the question is, based on the answer choices, what is actually benefiting the individual's reputation? And it's the community-minded action. So they're trying to say the more observable the action, the more likely the action is to benefit the individual's reputation. So what's a pronoun that can stand in for action? Not those, because those is plural. The only one that's going to work is it, because it's an object. They is wrong because it's plural. One is usually used for people. And so B is the best choice. This is the last passage, photosynthesis in the dark. Question 34, let's start reading in the beginning. Although it has been known for centuries that plants absorb carbon dioxide, a gas that animals exhale, it was not until the 1940s that scientists understood, blah, blah, blah. So the question that this is asking is, do we need a possessive for either centuries or plants? And the answer is no, because there's nothing in the sentence that belongs to plants or that belongs to centuries. So I'm going to cross out all the possessives. That's the original right there, centuries, plants, and the only one that fits is choice D. And the only difference between plants with an apostrophe S versus plants with an S apostrophe is whether it's going to be a single plant that has something or multiple plants that have something. Question 35, let's start right here. The discovery was made through a series of experiments conducted by the chemists Melvin Calvin and Benson. So right now the sentence looks okay. Let's see what they want to do with it. Choice B, experiments conducted by the chemists, comma, Melvin Calvin, and Andrew Benson. So choice B is interesting because they're using a comma right between the words chemists and their names. So technically what's going on here is that the two names, Melvin Calvin and Andrew Benson, are functioning as appositives. In other words, they're following the noun chemists and they're giving more information about it. So the real question is, are these appositives necessary or not necessary to the meaning of the sentence? And I'm going to argue that they're necessary because otherwise we don't know who they are. So in the case of appositives that are necessary or essential, you don't need to put commas before them. So B is really not necessary. So an example that I can give you is if you say Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet is one of his longest plays, the word Hamlet, which follows tragedy, is actually essential because without saying Hamlet, you don't really know which tragedy we're talking about, so you don't need commas there. If, on the other hand, you were to say Shakespeare's longest tragedy, Hamlet, is one of my favorite plays, then you actually don't need to say the word Hamlet because you're already identifying his longest tragedy. So in that particular case, since Hamlet is non-essential, you need commas. So all that is to say, in this particular case, Melvin Calvin and Andrew Benson seem to be essential appositives. They're nouns which add more information about who the chemists are, so you don't need a comma. Choice C, it was conducted by chemists Melvin Calvin, comma, and Andrew Benson. So in this particular case, they're using a comma to separate items in a list. You would only do that if there's more people. So Melvin Calvin, comma, Andrew Benson, and one other person. Question 36, let's start reading right after the colon. Plants would absorb and metabolize the CO2, the isotope, as though they are regular CO2, and then the researchers would track the isotope to determine what the plant had done with it. So I'm emphasizing the fact that this is the isotope because they're saying that the plants treated it as if it were the same. So notice what they're doing here. They're changing the number as well as the mood. So the first question is, what is they referring to? It's actually referring to the carbon dioxide isotope, and it's saying the plants absorb and metabolize the isotope as if it were the regular or the normal carbon dioxide. So number one, we want to change the plural to a singular, so we can cross off both choice A and choice B. Why is it singular? Because we're really thinking of carbon dioxide as one sort of abstract thing. You could probably argue that there are multiple molecules of carbon dioxide, but because there are so many, we're generally thinking of it as a singular concept or a single unit. So then the question becomes, is it were or is? And the reason we're using were is because this is actually a subjunctive mood, whereas is the indicative mood. The reason we're using subjunctive is because we're talking about a hypothetical scenario. They're saying the plant would absorb this as if it were regular CO2. In other words, the isotope is not actually CO2, but they're treating it as if it's CO2. So whenever you have something that's going on that's sort of contrary to fact or contrary to expectations, you need the subjunctive mood. So the most common usage of this is if you were to say something like, if I were a rock star. In other words, the reality is that you're not a rock star, but you're thinking of a hypothetical situation. You don't say, if I was a rock star, you say, if I were. So that's why subjunctive mood is necessary here. If you need to brush up, just look up usages of subjunctive mood versus the indicative mood, but we don't have enough time to talk about it here. Question 37, which choice most effectively introduces the events recounted in the paragraph? So notice what the paragraph is going to say. We're actually comparing two things. It says one sample was stored in the dark, blah, blah, blah. And then the next sentence is going to say the other sample. So as you're reading through these, that should naturally lead you to the answer, which is choice D. Calvin and Benson began with 2 samples of living algae, because the whole paragraph basically talks about the differences and the different pathways for those 2 samples. Let's go through the other ones real quick. The decision to use carbon labeling was critical to Calvin and Benson's success. So this is true, but the entire paragraph really just talks about the experiment and the differences between the 2 samples. So A is not going to work. Choice B, one advantage of using single-celled algae rather than other kinds of plants was that the algae could be conveniently collected and measured with a pipette. Also could be true, but given that this whole paragraph talks about the differences between the two samples and how the experiment was run, choice B is kind of off topic. Choice C, the question was, did light need to shine on the plants while they were breaking the bonds between the carbon and the oxygen atoms in CO2? So this was going to be a relevant question, but we don't really get to that until further down in the passage. This paragraph, again, is really just focused on how the experiment was conducted and how the samples were treated differently. So the best choice is going to be D. For question 38, we're going to start reading here. It says, one sample was stored in the dark for 8 hours. The air in that sample's container had CO2. The other sample was exposed to bright light for 1 hour. This sample was considered pre-illuminated. So as you're reading this, the question should come up in your mind, did this sample have CO2? Because otherwise you're not going to know all the variables in the experiment. So that should automatically lead you to choice B, which actually says that the air in that sample's container had no CO2. So the fact that it was considered pre-illuminated sort of repeats the idea that it was exposed to bright light for 1 hour, and there is really no significance about this designation, to call it pre-illuminated. So A, not a very good choice. C, the researchers used a 150-watt tungsten lamp. Okay, interesting, but not relevant to the paragraph or the experiment. D, the sample, like the other, consisted of 1 cubic centimeter of algae. Also important to establish that, you're trying to control all the variables. But again, it doesn't really answer the question as to whether the other sample had CO2 in it, which is important as far as this experiment goes. So B is the best choice for 38. Question 39, start reading over here. After removing the air from both containers and placing them in the dark, the samples were exposed to the CO2 by the researchers. So a couple of things to note. Notice that the original has just the CO2, whereas all the answer choices has the isotope because it's the 14. I'm not 100% sure whether this test was recreated improperly. I'd say it's likely that the original had the 14 in front of the C, because typically on the writing section, the SAT doesn't really ask about content. Now, if that were the case, you'd be forced to look for what the actual grammatical error is. And one thing we can say is that it's passive. So the SAT generally does not like the passive voice unless all the others are grammatically incorrect. So let's see what the other choices say. So after removing them and placing them in the dark, the CO2 exposure was initiated by the researchers. Again, also passive voice, instead of saying the researchers initiated the CO2 exposure. So B is going to be also out based on the passive voice. Choice C, the researchers exposed the samples to the isotope. So that one turns it back into the active voice. It's the subject doing the action. So better than A and B. Choice D, it was time for the researchers to expose the samples to CO2. This is kind of like C, except you have all this unnecessary word. It was time for. It also makes it sound a little bit informal. So overall, C is better than A and B because it's active, not passive. It's also better than D because D is kind of wordy. Question 40, let's start reading from the beginning of the paragraph. The sample initially stored in the dark container had produced almost no sugars made with the traceable carbon, 14, indicating that the algae hadn't metabolized the carbon dioxide. Finally, the algae had not been able to photosynthesize. So if you're reading this, you should realize that photosynthesizing and making the sugars and metabolizing the CO2 are kind of all the same thing. So it doesn't really make sense to say finally, because that would imply that we're talking about a process where this happened first, that happened next, and finally that happened last. That's probably not going to be the answer. Choice B says, however, and again, like I said, we're saying the same thing, so there's really no need for any words that signal a contrast. So B is going to be out, C is going to be out. And choice D, it says, in other words, the algae had not been able to photosynthesize. So D is the most appropriate because it's really summing up the two sentences before. The fact that they produced no sugars and the fact that it hadn't metabolized the carbon dioxide basically means that it did not perform photosynthesis. And that's what they're trying to say. Question 41, start reading right over here. It says, but the algae in the other sample, which had not been initially exposed to the 1 hour of light, produced measurable concentrations of radioactive, and it's going to say sugars. So the question here is, what is the best word to describe the amount of radioactive sugars? And this is a diction question, so you obviously just have to know how the words are used, but a lot of this comes down to connotation. So concentrations of sugars is okay because most likely they're measuring it within a solution, they're chemists. So for now, we'll keep that and we'll see if anything's better. Choice B, it says portions of radioactive sugars. So portions would imply that we're dividing it amongst one or a group of plants or something like that. Probably not as good as concentrations. Choice C, doses of radioactive sugar. So doses would imply that you're actually distributing it to someone or something, like a dose of medication. So not really what's going on here. So still A is going to be better. And choice D, measurable sums of radioactive sugars. Sums is okay, but it kind of has the connotation that you're sort of adding things up. But clearly that's not happening. They really just want to know what the amount is. And so concentration is going to be the best choice based mostly on connotation. Question 42, it says, which choice most effectively combines the underlined sentences in a way that makes clear that the carbon atoms are more central to the discussion than are the hydrogen and oxygen atoms? So remember, for these types of questions, you have to do exactly what they want. So let's read the original, 42. In the sample, carbon atoms from the isotope have been used to construct the frame of the sugar glucose. Oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule were also used. So basically they want to emphasize that the carbon is more important than the oxygen and hydrogen. So let's see how they combine it. Choice A, in the sample, carbon atoms from the isotope have been used along with oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule to construct the frame of the sugar glucose. So A seems to work because what they're doing is the main subject of the sentence is the carbon atoms, and that was used to construct the frame. And they're adding the oxygen and hydrogen within two dashes, which kind of implies that they're there, but they're not as important because they're not part of the main structure of the sentence. So A looks okay. We'll keep it around. B, carbon atoms from the isotope and oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule have been used to construct the frame of the sugar glucose. So B, especially when compared to A, doesn't make it exactly clear that the oxygen and the hydrogen are less important than the carbon dioxide. It almost seems like they are of equal importance. So A is still going to be better than B. Choice C, the frame of the sugar glucose had been constructed in the sample using not only carbon atoms from the CO2, but also oxygen and hydrogen. So if you're using this construction, not only this, but also this and this, you're actually saying that these two are as important or sometimes even more important than the first item. So this construction, not only A, also B, gives way too much importance to the oxygen and hydrogen, so it's actually worse than choice B in terms of what we want the sentence to do. Choice D, in conjunction with the carbon items from the isotope, this sample had also used oxygen and hydrogen atoms from another molecule to construct the frame of the sugar glucose. So again, D, similar to C, is actually emphasizing the oxygen and hydrogen over and above the isotope, because it says in addition to this sample had also used, so you can feel that the emphasis is on the oxygen and hydrogen right here. So definitely wrong, and out of all the choices, choice A is going to be the one that works. Question 43, let's start reading right over here. During its CO2 starved exposure to light, the algae had restored the light's energy and then later using that stored energy to construct sugars in the dark. So to simplify the sentence, I'm really just going to cross out this first part and then I'm going to read it. The algae had stored the light's energy and then later using that energy. The problem here is this whole phrase, using that stored energy, is a participle phrase. A participle is basically you take a verb, add an ing, it becomes an adjective, but it's not describing a noun. So one way to fix this would be the algae had stored the light's energy and then later using that stored energy to construct sugars in the dark, comma, the algae did something else. So that would be an acceptable way by keeping this phrase as a participle. Not the greatest sentence. Perhaps a more efficient way to correct this would be to change the participle into a main verb. You can say the algae had stored the light's energy and then later used that stored energy to construct sugars in the dark. That would be another way to fix it. Either way, they don't really give either of those as a choice. So A is going to be out. Let's see how they want us to fix it. Choice B, the algae had stored the light's energy, then later using that stored energy. So the same problem here. When you have a semicolon, you need two complete sentences on both sides. The second one does not count as a complete sentence because number one, you're lacking a subject, and number two, using as an ing form by itself would mean that it's a participle. So there's really no main verb here. So B is going to be out. Choice C, the algae had stored the light's energy, comma, it then later used that stored energy. So we fixed the participle problem. We do have a main verb. Now we have two complete sentences connected by a comma. That's a comma splice because you need a conjunction. So to fix a comma splice, you can either turn it into two sentences with a period, or you can connect it with a conjunction. So if you said something like, the algae had stored the light's energy, and it then later used blah, 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 that would work. But right now, does not work. So that leaves choice D. The algae had stored the light's energy, period. It then later used that stored energy to construct sugars in the dark. So D is acceptable, even though it's breaking it up into two rather short sentences. So I don't know, stylistically, I don't know if it's the best, but clearly out of these four choices, it is the best. Question 44, the writer wants to interpret the results of the experiment, that's what we just read, and set up the statement of the researcher's conclusion provided at the beginning of the next paragraph. Which choice most effectively accomplishes this goal? So I think you really want to focus on, we're looking for an answer choice that sets up the statement in the next paragraph. So what do they say in the next paragraph? Let's start over here. Through this experiment, Calvin and Benson were able to conclude that light was not directly responsible for breaking CO2's bonds. So light not being responsible is the idea. Let's go through the answer choices. Choice A, Calvin and Benson published their findings as part of a series of papers called The Path of Carbon and Photosynthesis. Too vague, not really related to that sentence. Choice B, although the experiment yielded some answers, questions remained. So it is true that they did not get all the answers that they were looking for, but that really doesn't lead very well to that first sentence. Choice C, this experiment in conjunction with many others advanced the researchers' understanding of photosynthesis. Also feels kind of general, but C is still better than A and B, so we'll keep it around. D, light did not have to shine on the plant while these chemical reactions took place. So yeah, that one seems to work the best because that kind of summarizes what happened before, and then it leads directly to this idea that the conclusion was that light was not directly responsible. So D seems like the best choice. I'm not sure if it's an overall great way to end that other paragraph, but certainly compared to A, B, and C, it seems better. So we'll go with that one.